Muslim philosophers or philosophers of science also, namely Professor Syed Hussenas from George Washington University, I believe, and also our own local philosopher, Professor Syed Muhammad Najib Alatas. So this week, I will continue with three more Islamic thinkers, and I put them together because they have articulated what I would call a non-metaphysical approach towards the issue of Islam and science. Yeah? Last week, the views of Syed Hussenas and Syed Muhammad Najib Alatas, I would categorize as having adopted the metaphysical approach, where they use ideas from Islamic metaphysics and Islamic philosophy in order to look at science. So they do not privilege the scientific perspective in their view of nature or reality, but instead they adopted the traditional Islamic viewpoint concerning reality, concerning nature, and so on, based largely on the Quran and Hadith, and from there look at science. So it's not the other way. It's not trying to accommodate scripture to science, but instead conforming science to scripture. Yeah? So that is one orientation adopted by contemporary Muslim thinkers on science, seen from a religious perspective, i.e. Islamic perspective. Yeah? Now, the second main orientation is what I would classify as non-metaphysical approach. Although, of course, this does not mean that they are monolithic or in complete agreement with one another. It's just that they do not adopt Islamic metaphysics in looking at science, or rather, they do not privilege Islamic metaphysics in looking at science. And there are three of them here I would discuss under this rubric of non-metaphysical approach. Namely, number one, Ziauddin Sada. Number two, Pervez Footboy. And number three, a more recent writer, the Algerian scholar who is based somewhere in the Middle East. I can't remember which university is teaching at now, Sharjah or somewhere, or maybe UAE. I have to check that out. By the name of Nidal Guasson, who has written a book, or maybe more than one book, but I think the famous book is Quantum Questions, and a few articles published mainly in the prestigious journal Zygon concerning religion. And Ziauddin Sada, of course, has written much earlier compared to, for example, Nidal Guasson. He has started writing way back in the 70s, Science, Technology, and Islam, Science, Technology, and Development in the Muslim World or something. And Touch of Midas, Revenge of Athena, and many articles also published in, some of them published in prestigious British journals like Nature and New Scientist. So that's basically my game plan today, to articulate the non-metaphysical approach towards Islam and science, as expressed through the views of Ziauddin Sada, Pervez Footboy, and Nidal Guasson. Yeah. And then I will relate it to my earlier lectures on the metaphysical approach. And I would argue that Muslims need both perspectives, in fact, i.e. the metaphysical and the non-metaphysical approach in dealing with science, in trying to adopt a position regarding science from an Islamic perspective. because either one is incomplete in itself. Yeah. So I would say that they are complementary. These two approaches are complementary, and I will explain why in a moment. Yeah. Partly it's to do with the realities of the modern age. I'm not trying to say that we should try to sort of compromise with modernity. That's not my point. But we will see how important it is to come to grips with contemporary reality, yeah, for the sake of the survival of the Muslim Ummah, without necessarily compromising anything which is of real value within the Islamic faith. Yeah. And if I have time, I will move on to the postscript, which is a very important issue, actually, the Muslim dilemma. And I will explain what I mean by the Muslim dilemma, and also the ways we can deal with this issue of the Muslim dilemma regarding science and religion. By the way, I'm not using my usual headphone tonight. Is it clear? Is my voice clear? Can you hear me? If not, I might have to put my speaker and headphone on.
Yes, Prof, but a bit, if you put your headphone, maybe much better.
Okay,
we can hear clearly.
Yeah. Then I might have to take off my songkok neck. And I cannot be a Kia anymore. That's the point.
Become Kia modern.
Yeah, modern. Yeah.
Okay. So now you can see my botak head now. Eh?
Wisdom.
Inilah banyak sangat makanan MSG ni sebab duduk seorang ni. Order food panda. Habis gugur rambut. Okay. Is it better now? The sound?
Better. No echo. It's nice.
Echo tak ada ya, badan je ada ya. Okay, bagus. Okay. So as I've said earlier, I will focus on the ideas of Zainuddin Sadar, Prof. Boy, and Idil Kusum. And although their views are different, yeah, I mean, for example, Prof. Boy is quite critical of Zainuddin Sadar. Yeah? He thinks that Sadar's attempt at in Islamizing science, for example, at least the initial Sadar, now I think has changed somewhat. When Prof. wrote his book, Islam and Science, 1992, he did refer to Sadar in a rather critical way. And at that time, Sadar was trying to promote Islamization of science of some sort. And Professor Boy criticized Sadar for that. So it does not mean to say that they are all in complete agreement with one another. I think the agreement between Najib and Nas in the metaphysical camp was much closer as compared to these three guys under what I would lump as a non-metaphysical approach. Yeah? But nevertheless, they share something in common, which is that they see the pragmatic need for Muslims to engage in science and technology and to advance the frontiers of science and technology for the sake of the Muslim Ummah. Yeah. So even though, for example, someone like Sadar is critical of science, saying that it is value-laden and so on, and yet he sees the need for Muslims to develop science and technology within their own society in order to cope with contemporary realities, yeah, where in the international world order nowadays, yeah, is very much bent on economic development, which is based on knowledge-based economy. And if it's a knowledge-based economy, it has to make use of science in the form of R&D and so on. So Sada was quite aware of this kind of issues. Yeah? So is Nidal Goswami, being a physicist himself. I think he's an astrophysicist. He's very much into science, and so he does not think that Muslims should, contemporary Muslims should disregard science or should take it lightly, but should pursue science. Yeah, but nevertheless, from an Islamic position. Yeah? So Nidal Goswami does not abandon the Islamic position, although he tries to sort of find a middle way out of it. Yeah? And so does Footboy. He thinks that we need science and technology, but how to balance it with the Islamic perspective, Islamic faith, that is the challenge, I think. Yeah? I will start with Ziauddin Sada. His critique of modern science and his Islamic alternative. So for Sada, science is not value-free. Instead, it is value-laden, where these values are a product of Western culture, and they are not universal values necessarily. Because other societies, non-Western societies especially, might have different values. Yeah. And therefore, to claim that science is universal, for him is not quite right, because the values which underlay science or underlie science, these are cultural specific, i.e. specific to Western culture. Yeah? So for example, you find the ideals such as, or values such as conquest and control of nature, which in the end leads to exploitation of nature, is very much a Western worldview of the world. Yeah, as found in the philosophy of Francis Bacon, for example. Francis Bacon is a 16th. He spans both the 16th and 17th century. Normally cited as a 17th century thinker. And he was the one who shifted the perspective on science from science purely as knowledge to science as something which should benefit humanity. In other words, it should yield practical fruits. And that is why he's very much into linking science with technology. Yeah, so that we have a grip on nature, we can control nature. Yeah, so Bacon adopts a rather, what one would call, in Greek mythology, you have this Dionysius versus Apollo, and so on. So Dionysius, I can't recall that, Dionysius or something like that, is very much a masculine principle. Yeah, that means to say that the attitude towards nature is quite aggressive. Yeah? And Bacon, his philosophy, although he did not sort of openly express it as such, but it is something like that. Yeah? And he has this famous saying which says, nature would not reveal her secrets unless vexed. Vexed means unless it is provoked. So this brings us into the philosophy of experimentation. That means we should probe into nature. We should carry out experiments. We should alter natural conditions in order to find out how nature behaves. Yeah, with the ultimate objective of finally controlling nature. You see? So this ideal of man being in charge of nature in this constant struggle throughout history, what he saw as a battle between man and nature, between man and natural forces. Yeah. So for someone like Bacon, we should have the upper hand. And we can only have the upper hand if we apply our knowledge through technology in subduing nature so as to enable us to be free from natural disasters or natural events that have adverse effects on us and so on. Yeah? And Bacon asked questions like, is truth barren? Is truth barren? Meaning to say that, has knowledge no practical application? Yeah? So all this suggests that we should act on nature and find out how nature actually behaves in order to control nature. Yeah. Now, this is a value which is very much associated with Western culture, yeah? And also this attitude of exploiting nature and not only having a grip over nature, but having a control over other human societies. It eventually leads to colonialism. Yeah. Now, you might think that this is quite fanciful. I mean, after all, is just Francis Bacon, one single person. How could he be equated with Western civilization as a whole? But that's not quite the case. Why is that so? Because Francis Bacon was quite influential in the formation of the Royal Society of London. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, it's officially regarded by historians of science as the first scientific society in the world. Second was the Academy of Sciences in Paris. Yeah. So Bacon's philosophy was quite influential on the Royal Society. Yeah. And Royal Society is a society which brings together scientists, yeah, British scientists, in order to advance the cause of science and technology. And they carry out experiments, we have weekly gatherings and so on, and they adopted the experimental methodology. Yeah. And that was when science became practical and applied to nature, yeah? With the objective of finally controlling nature. Yeah? If you read his New Atlantis, there you have a vision of R&D and so on, where knowledge can be produced and control nature. Yeah? So that ideal has been the driving force of scientific and technological work in the West. Yeah? But it can never be reached because we can see that even now, yeah, we are still struggling against natural forces. Yeah? The coronavirus, for example, yeah? Despite the advances in modern science, yeah? We can't even deal with a pandemic like coronavirus. Yeah? We come up with vaccines and then you find that there are new variants and so on. So Bacon was quite right in the sense that man is in a constant struggle against nature and that we have to use science in order to subdue nature. But it seems that it's a never-ending battle. Yeah. But that's the basic philosophy behind Western thinking concerning nature, and that is expressed through their science. Yeah? And one can get a better sense of this if one compares it to, for example, to something which is considered as the opposite of this kind of masculine approach, which is an Eastern philosophy like Taoism, for example, yeah? Where the attitude to adopt is to live in harmony with nature, to go with the flow of nature and not to go against nature. Yeah? So you can see the point if you contrast it with something like a Taoist view of nature, yeah? Living in harmony with nature and so on. Yeah? And so there are other values, of course, which I won't elaborate tonight. Yeah? But the point to make here, to see here, is that according to Zia Sada, science is not value-free, but there are certain values which underlie science. Yeah? For example, what is the nature of reality and so on. Reality is basically physical and so on. And it is these values, yeah, that one should examine according to Sada. Yeah? And if there are Islamic teachings, but then we should try and replace them with Islamic values. Yeah. So
We are losing Prof. Hazim. He will come back. Prof, unmute, Prof. Okay, Prof.
I'm sorry. So there are 10 values. I'm sorry about that. Yeah? There are 10 values which have been listed down by Sada, which he believes should be the values which Muslims should adopt in practicing science. Namely, 4 basic values, which are Tawheed, Khilafah, Ibadah, and Ilm. And then there are 6 values which comes in pairs. Yeah. The first pair is halal and haram. That means we should go for that which is halal and avoid that which is haram. For example, in our application of scientific knowledge. Yeah? And number 7 and 8 constitutes the second pair, adil and zulm, that is justice and tyranny or injustice. And then the last one is istisla and diya, basically public interest and wastage, going against public interest. Yeah? So he elaborates on these 10 ethical values, which he believes should be the guiding principles for Muslims to adopt in thinking about science and also in practicing science. Yeah? For example, the principle of Tawheed is this to see unity in God's creation, yeah? To see that there is an interconnection between things in this world, so that we do not see God's creation as being fragmented, for example. So it's basically an outlook which Muslims should take concerning nature. And then there's principle of Khilafah, yeah? Man as God's representative on earth, as God's vicegerent on earth. And what this entails in terms of our duties and obligations as Khilafah, that we should carry out God's trust in this world. We should carry out his amanah, yeah, and not act against his commandments and so on. And the idea of ibadah, worship, science as a form of ibadah, for example, it's a form of knowledge which enables us to know God's creation better, so that by understanding the laws which governs the working of the world, which are basically created by God himself, then we could appreciate God's creation, that there is order in his creation, for example. And then ilm, which is knowledge, to cultivate scientific knowledge, is considered as a duty of Muslims also. So all these things are principles which Muslims should adopt in approaching science. And then, of course, the three pairs that I've mentioned just now. Yeah? So that is quite an important point which Sada is advocating. In fact, you could even relate it to science policy. Yeah, for example, DIA is to do with avoiding wastage. So we shouldn't waste. So this can be related to, for example, the practice of recycling, which is very popular now, and of course related to the broader issue of sustainable development and so on. Yeah? So it provides us with a set of principles by which we can look at science and also carry out our scientific practice and our science policy. Yeah? So as I put here, as I've written here, it should be noted that Sada's approach leaves the content of science intact. That means he's not suggesting that we come up with an alternative science. Yeah? Islamic science, meaning to say a science which is different from the science which is taught in the West, for example, physics, chemistry, and so on, and come up with our own theories of nature and so on. No, that's not what he's advocating. Yeah? Because otherwise you're going to reinvent the wheel. Yeah, and that would probably put us back by several centuries. Yeah? So the content, as far as the content of science goes, yeah, this is left intact. That means to say that we still learn the physics that is taught in the universities today, electromagnetism, thermodynamics, Newtonian mechanics, quantum theory, relativity, and so on. We don't change that. It's quite disastrous, in fact. Yeah? But we simply put an Islamic gloss on nature or on science, and use those values to steer the growth and application of science in a direction which is consonant, which is compatible, which is in line with Islamic values. Yeah? Now, okay, so fine. Yeah, in a sense, this is I think this ethical approach is something which I am quite in agreement with. Yeah? However, there is one criticism against this approach. Yeah? And this criticism is this. Yeah? It is the idealism that is found in Sada's approach and lack of understanding of how science and technology operate within the world capitalist system. Yeah? For example, science is very much needed in R&D for purposes of commercialization. So scientific knowledge has become a commodified form of knowledge. Yeah? For a value to be put into practice, it must somehow take cognizance of the world capitalist order in which science is embedded. Yeah? So the contemporary reality is that science is part of the world capitalist economic system. Yeah, and you can clearly see this. Yeah, in the language which science policymakers use. For example, the so-called K economy, knowledge economy. Yeah, which is basically the use of R&D for purposes of technological innovation and so on. Yeah? Which is basically to create products which are profitable in the market. Yeah? And now, of course, you have this idea of Industrial Revolution 4.0. Yeah? Again, putting it into perspective, that what this implies is that science has become part of the world economic system, which is a capitalist system, actually. Yeah? So unless you take this into account, you're not going to go far with your 10 values. Yeah, you can say what you like, but the actual practice of science is entrenched within this world capitalist order. Yeah? So one has to have this realistic understanding of how science operates within the world capitalist order. Yeah? In order for there to be any chance of implementing such value system within regarding science. Yeah. And here I mentioned something about recycling, because that's something which is quite popularly known, and we are all quite familiar with the idea. So it's easy for me to introduce this aspect of it when I refer to recycling. I mean, almost every taman perumahan in Malaysia now, they have this, boxes or places where you can put your recycle waste so that it can be recycled, plastic, paper, and so on. Yeah? Now, recycling, which is related to value 10, which is avoidance of wastage, DIA, I think, is accepted as part of what is known as natural capitalism. That is capitalism that somehow makes use of products of nature or try to go back to nature and so on, but you can still make money with it. Yeah? Now, without economic realism, it is difficult to implement Sada's proposal. So, if you look at, for example, something like recycling as something which is economically viable, and that it jives in, it is aligned to the principle of the avoidance of wastage, then it's fine. Yeah. And then I wrote some more. I said, however, as a disclaimer and partly in support of Sada, we should bear in mind that a value can sometimes appear idealistic in one historical period, but pragmatic at a later period. For example, critique of our exploitation of natural resources made by the Club of Rome Report 1997, published into a book entitled Limits to Growth by Dennis Meadows et al., has partly been responsible for the sustainable development approach in economics, which is endorsed by the United Nations. And in this regard, I would also like to mention the book written by Syed Hussein Nas, Man in Nature. I think it was first published in 1960s, maybe 1968. And that somehow has led to deep ecology and so on, which is advocated by a Norwegian philosopher, I think by the name of Arne Næss. So it has led to a paradigm shift in our thinking about nature, and economic development. Yeah. So sometimes it is quite possible that you start off with something idealistic, at one period in history at a certain age, but later on, it became accepted as a new norm, as a new moral value. So for example, now we are quite familiar with the idea of sustainable development. And in fact, it has already been endorsed by the nations in terms of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Whatever you do now, you have to align yourself with SDG. Whereas that is something which was quite unknown back in the 70s, when the policymakers were quite gung-ho about exploiting natural resources to the hill, in economic development. But when they realized the disastrous consequences of doing that, as pointed out by, for example, the book by Dennis Meadows and the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, in the 70s, they realized that you're going to leave this world in a mess to the future generations if we keep on exploiting natural resources at the rate we're going. And even now, we are already realizing the negative effects of that through climate change and global warming and so on. So it is quite possible that, what appeared as idealistic, for example, when Syed Hussein has put forward those ideas in his book, Man in Nature, that we should not approach or treat nature aggressively for economic growth, but act in harmony with nature. That sort of principle was considered as idealistic at one stage, but now it's not. So it's quite possible that this could happen with Sada's proposal as well. But whatever it is, I still think that Sada has to take note of contemporary economic realities, and see how science can be practiced within the constraints imposed by the present economic system. And Sada has also criticized Syed Hussein Nas. He's criticized Nas for taking an overly metaphysical approach to science, which has no bearing on science policy and scientific practice, which is what Muslims need as, sorry, I'm thinking the contents is saying, which is what Muslims need as guidance in their approach to science and the scientific work. So all the holy ink spilled by Syed Hussein Nas seems not to have any benefit for Muslims who are seeking guidance on how to deal with science in contemporary society or in their daily lives. I think this point is quite pertinent. Point made by Sada regarding Syed Hussein Nas's metaphysical approach. Fine. I mean, on the one hand, there is a need for such an approach to clarify certain matters which might relate to Aqidah and so on. But for the ordinary Muslim, your ordinary man on the street, the proverbial man in the street, ordinary Muslim man in the street, he needs to know about what to do regarding science. Like, for example, if he's working as a technician in a factory, he just cannot, listen to this fancy talk about the cosmology of medieval Islam and so on without getting some practical advice on what to do, either in the lab or in the factory, or simply as an ordinary citizen having to deal with science and technology in the modern age. So that is what is lacking in Nas, I think, and which Sada has pointed out, that there is no practical advice or policy guidance that issues from Nas's writings. And also Nas's approach, unless you are grounded in Islamic philosophy and intellectual thought and so on, it's quite difficult to make sense of what he's trying to say. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that we should all democratize thinking. No. You have to sort of elevate yourself to a certain level also. Otherwise, you cannot appreciate the works of Al-Ghazali and so on. But somehow or other, the ideas of Nas seems to have not an impact on ordinary people because they didn't quite see the relevance of his philosophical ideas in terms of their daily life and daily practice as a scientist or as someone who makes use of science and technology and so on. Okay, let's move on to the next Muslim thinker under the non-metaphysical approach, Pervez Footboy. Pervez Footboy is famous for his book Islam and Science, and with the subtitle Religious Orthodoxy and the Battle for Rationality, which was published in 1992. And he has criticized the Islamization of science project, which was quite popular in the 1980s, because he thinks that it will only perpetuate Muslim backwardness in science and technology in relation to the non-Muslim world. Hence, to him, Islamization of science is counterproductive. This idea that we should create a science which is exclusively Islamic, which is different from science as it is practiced in the West and so on. For Footboy, we are wasting our time doing that because what we should be doing is catching up with the West, because Muslim world is very much behind in terms of modern science and technology. He quotes certain figures to show Muslim backwardness in science and technology. And nowadays, of course, science in science policy studies, you find, for example, based on the 4 indicators, S&T indicators, two of which are what is known as input indicators, and the other 2 is output indicators. In input indicators, I think is R&D expenditure as part of GNP or GDP, and then scientific manpower. And in terms of output, scientific publication, and also patents. Yeah? So based on these indicators, science policymakers have pointed out that the Muslim world is very much behind. Yeah, for example, R&D as a percentage of GDP is not even 1%. Yeah? Well, of course, you have to think of other things. You know, it's not only a matter of spending money on R&D, but how economically productive it can be. But for advanced countries like Japan and so on, their expenditure on R&D is around 2% or so, but then it does yield economic benefits, yeah? Because the system is already in place. Yeah? So Herdboy is quite a realist in this sense. Yeah? So he says that, look, what we should be thinking of is how to advance our science and technology so as to be on par with the advanced countries, not to come up with something like Islamization of science, which ignores the present problems and instead tries to create this feel-good feeling amongst Muslims by harking back to the past, glories of medieval Islamic civilization and how they were the world leaders then and so on. And also his point about history of science, that if you look at history of science in the Islamic world in the past, what is the cause of the decline of science is the opposition of certain groups, like, for example, the Orthodox ulama, who were not in favor of philosophy, Greek philosophy namely, and were not in favor of science, or at least not putting them in the center of Islamic culture, yeah, but marginalizing them. And he was very much in favor of the Mu'tazila, yeah, because the Mu'tazila were rationalists, and during the reign of the Mu'tazila Caliph, like, for example, Khalifa like Al-Ma'mun, there was this movement called the translation movement by Hikmah and so on, where Greek science and philosophy was translated into Arabic, and that laid the basis for the advancement of science in the Islamic world. So Mu'tazila ideology was very much related to the advancement of science, according to Herdboy. But his view of history of science, I think, is quite flawed. And this has been pointed out by professional historians of science, such as George Saliba at Columbia University. Because if you look at the actual development of science in the Islamic world, medieval Islamic science in the medieval Islamic past, you find that even under Orthodox caliphs like Al-Mutawakkil, who was not a Mu'tazilite. In fact, they were against Mu'tazila theology. Even under those conservative Khalifa, you find that science was still advancing. Yeah, because science, the period of golden age of science in the Islamic world was somewhere around between the 9th to the 12th century and continued into the 14th. Yeah? So if you say that, for example, it was the Orthodox caliphs or Orthodox ulama like Al-Ghazali was responsible for the decline of science because they adopted what pervasive negative attitude towards science by Muslims, then you find that this is not a tenable thesis. It's not a thesis which can be defended. Yeah, because if you look at Al-Ghazali, for example, there are some scholars, in fact, many who have criticized Al-Ghazali and blame him for causing the decline of science in the Islamic world because of his attack on rational thought as expressed through Greek philosophy. But if you look at the period in which Al-Ghazali lived and wrote, he died in, I can't forget this year, 1111 AD. Very easy to remember, 1111 AD, which is early part of the 12th century. Yeah? But you find that the progress of science in the Islamic world continued much further than the early part of the 12th century. So even after Al-Ghazali, science continued to flourish. Not only science, in fact, philosophy continued to flourish. In what form? In the form of the counter critique by Ibn Rushd. People forget that Ibn Rushd was a later figure. He was not a contemporary of Al-Ghazali. Yeah? Ibn Rushd came after Al-Ghazali, I think probably about a century later, yeah? Which shows that philosophy, even philosophy, not only science, but philosophy was still flourishing in the Islamic world after Al-Ghazali. And after the Mutazilite Khalifa. Yeah, so to say that orthodoxy was the cause of decline of science in the Islamic world is simply historically false. So there must be other factors. It's a complex issue. Yeah? So Prof. Hoodboy has gone on a sort of what I would call a cherry-picking exercise. That means he selects certain instances which suit his belief about science and Islam and use it as a basis for making the argument. But if you look at the falsity of that claim, then the basis on which he constructs his argument is simply destroyed. So I don't think that Hoodboy has sound ground to stand on when he referred to the history of science to support his argument regarding orthodoxy and so on as the cause for decline of Islamic science. The decline was there, but it's not as simple as he puts it. I think his reasoning was quite simplistic. So to carry that over and say that, look, the same thing is happening now, we find that there is this orthodox views regarding science and religion, even in the form of Islamization of knowledge and so on, is the likely cause of further decline of science Islam. I think that is not supported. Yeah? Okay. And then Nidal Goswami and the assumption of methodological naturalism. Nidal Goswami is the third figure that I'm looking at tonight. Yeah? I have met him personally at a conference in Istanbul, I believe. Yeah, Science Task Force, Science and Islam Task Force. Yeah? Very much into science and quite a pleasant guy actually. And his concern was how to practice science in the current climate. Yeah. Where you find that the world leadership in science is basically from the West, yeah? And the paradigms and so on created by Western scientists and so on. And Muslim scientists is very much working at the periphery. If you think in terms of the core and periphery relationship, the third world, so-called, where Muslim countries are mainly found, they are very much part of this world order where they are at the periphery and the core, the center, is found in the West, yeah? Countries like America or Germany or France. That's where the leadership is, or even Russia. And now, of course, Japan and China is coming into the picture as well. Yeah? So for someone like Nidal Goswami, who's a practicing physicist, yeah, he cannot simply abandon the framework developed by the core and which has become institutionalized in the institution of science as practiced even in Muslim countries. Yeah. So, for example, even in Malaysia, yeah, scientists working in Malaysia still have to adopt the norms which are accepted internationally. Otherwise, you can't get your articles published in Western ISI journals, for example, if you don't conform to those standards, yeah? and norms of behavior expected of a scientist, for example. So you cannot simply, lay down your Islamic assumption and say, look, this is what Islam says, and this is what I'm going to follow. I don't consider myself part of the world scientific community. That's just simply not on. Yeah. So, but at the same time, he wants to retain his Islamic faith. Yeah. So he came up with this concept of methodological naturalism, which is actually not his originally. What I mean to say is that he was not the originator of this idea, but he sort of endorsed it. Yeah? I think he himself was quite honest about it. He quoted this guy Stilwell, who said something about methodological naturalism. And here I just read this out. The concept of methodological naturalism is a pillar of modern science, one which explicitly or implicitly leads to conflicts or at least to difficulties in the harmonization of science with Islam. It is important to distinguish it from philosophical or metaphysical naturalism, which is the atheistic claim of non-existence of supernatural entities altogether, what is often referred to as materialism. Okay, the latter, which is philosophical naturalism, I think, is a position that many philosophers and scientists adopt, but it's not a principle of science. It's basically a philosophical principle. Yeah? And here he quotes Phil Stilwell, the originator of this concept, I think. Methodological naturalism is provisional epistemology and ontology that provides a framework upon which to do science. MN entails that science begin each particular inquiry with the assumption that any explanation will fall within the existing matrix of established material definitions and laws. That means to say that you accept that the world behaves according to the laws of nature, or according to the known laws of nature which science has discovered so far. MN also implies that if a natural explanation does not immediately emerge from the inquiry, we do not default to a declaration of a supernatural cause. In simple words, what he's saying here is that if we cannot find an explanation for a natural phenomena or phenomena that is found in nature based on our current scientific knowledge, then we should not simply take the option or take the course of appealing to some supernatural causation or power in trying to explain that phenomena, which cannot be explained by the current laws of nature or scientific laws. Yeah? So in other words, you make the assumption that there is no supernatural intervention in the natural order, in natural world. Yeah. In order to carry out your scientific work, because if you make such assumptions, then there is no basis for carrying out scientific inquiry, scientific research, because the supernatural cannot be known through rational and empirical means, whereas science is based on the rational and the empirical approach. Yeah? And it says that MN has proved, or methodological naturalism has proved itself efficient in advancing scientific exploration and discoveries. And this is a reasonable minimalist assumption. And which makes it superfluous to call upon supernatural agents when material causes can explain the phenomena. And indeed, supernatural explanation was soon identified as science stoppers. That means once you say that, well, it is God's action in the world, then there is no more incentive for carrying out science research, because you've already got the explanation. So there's no more problem to be solved. Yeah? So to him, as a Muslim scientist, he thinks that it is okay to adopt methodological naturalism. And here I explain further what is meant by methodological rather than philosophical or metaphysical. If you subscribe to, for example, something like philosophical or metaphysical naturalism, then this is you're making a stronger claim. Whereas methodological naturalism is not is a milder version. Yeah? Philosophical naturalism or metaphysical naturalism implies that the physical world is all there is. Yeah? And that this physical world acts according to certain laws of nature as discovered through science. Yeah? So there is no divinity involved in the functioning of the natural world. Yeah? In other words, you leave God out of the picture. Yeah? This is what philosophical naturalism would entail, that nature can be understood without referring to supernatural forces. Yeah? So that is a stronger claim, whereas methodological naturalism is different. Yeah? It involves a milder claim that for purposes of doing scientific research, we assume that only natural forces or laws of nature are at work, and that we don't have to appeal to supernatural forces in the explanation of natural events or phenomena. Yeah. So that is to say that using this principle, it is rational for the Muslim scientist to carry on his scientific work. So he has sort of, if you use phenomenological language, you bracket out the supernatural when you are in your lab and when you're on your desk working as a scientist. Yeah. But this is something which nevertheless could be a problem. Why? Because it's difficult to harmonize this with the Quranic view of natural phenomena and causation involving natural phenomena. Yeah. For example, I put here under point number 2. Eh? But it nevertheless could lead to problems in the harmonization of science and religion, because in the Quran, God does not express his anger and act of retribution through natural forces and natural calamities, such as storms and earthquakes. For example, the punishment on the Ad and Thamud tribes and people, where God sends down all these natural disasters like storms and earthquakes in order to punish the Ad and the Thamud and so on. If you read the Quran, you find this. Yeah. So this seems to go against the idea of causation as accepted even in methodological naturalism, which says that only laws of nature should be appealed to in explaining natural phenomena, natural events. Yeah? And earthquakes and so on are natural events, natural phenomena. Yeah. So in the end, you have at some stage to abandon methodological naturalism. Yeah? If you want to harmonize your views as a Muslim with the Quran, for example. Yeah. So I think this should also be a consideration when thinking about these things. Yeah? And bullet point number 3, I try to resolve this by making a distinction, as found in philosophy also, between what is known as horizontal and vertical causation. Yeah? Natural causation is horizontal, that is operating within the natural physical plane. Vertical causation, however, involves the direct action of a transcendent divine onto the physical plane. And horizontal causation is also referred to as asbab. Yeah? And science only deals with horizontal causation. Yeah? So, for example, when you read the Quran and find passages in the Quran which says that God has punished people like Ad and Thamud by sending down all these natural calamities, you can think of it in terms of vertical causation, whereas understanding at the same time that it operates through horizontal causation. Yeah. So I think Nidal Goswami needs to refine his approach towards methodological naturalism a bit, in order that it might not conflict with what we have in scripture, i.e. in Quran. And an easy example, I think, which I can give tonight, in order to make this point clear, is to think of something like, for example, the cause of death. Yeah, the cause of death. Yeah. I think Muslims are quite familiar with this approach in giving an explanation. Yeah. I think since there are many who understand Malay language, I'll use the Malay language for a while because it brings out the idea better. Yeah? The idea of ajal, ajal dan maut, maut ajal di tangan Tuhan. Jadi bila orang tu mati, kita kata ajal dia dah sampai. Ya. Tapi kita kata nak dijadikan sebab dia mati sebab aksiden ke ataupun sebab terjatuh di bilik air ke, itu cuma disebab. Ya. The horizontal cause. But the vertical cause is ajal dia dah sampai. Yeah. So as scientists, or medical practitioners, you can very well understand that at the official level, you have to appeal to horizontal causation. What do I mean by this? Yeah. For example, if you are a medical officer, working in hospital and someone dies, and you have to issue a death certificate as a doctor. Takkan kita nak tulis itu, apakah sebab kematian, ajalnya sudah sampai. Ya, tak diterima tu statement tu. Medical officer tulis ajalnya sudah sampai. Dia kena tulis something like, for example, cardiac arrest or asphyxiation. That means no oxygen getting into his lungs or whatever. Some natural causation explanation or horizontal causation explanation. Because that is a language accepted in the medical field, for example. Tapi if you write something like ajalnya sudah sampai, then people might think that you are not a medical doctor, but you are kiai. It's a kiai, you can say that. Yeah. So you see the difference between the two ways of speaking, but they not necessarily conflict with one another. Okay, if you get my point. By the way, is my voice clear? Boleh dengar, ya?
Yeah, very clear, Prof. But you have to translate that ajal dah sampai,
yes.
Prof.
Are you all hearing me?
Yes, very, very clear.
Boleh dengar, ya?
Yeah, but you have to translate the Malay word that you just saying.
Oh, I mean, the angel of death has
the time has come.
His soul, ya? Okay. Ajal apa ini dalam perkataan Inggeris?
Death has arrived.
That is.
The time has come.
The time has come for the angel of death to take his soul out. So that is how Muslims look at death. Yeah, the cause of death. That there is this unseen angel. Yeah, but But in your medical report, if you are a doctor, you don't say that. They say that his time has come. Yeah. Otherwise, people think you're wasting your 5 years medical practice, medical training without giving the medical reason.
Unmute, Prof. Unmute. Prof, unmute.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So so that's basically the point that for Muslims, apart from looking at natural causation, they also look at a metaphysical at the metaphysical level where things operate differently, but nevertheless connected to the physical world. Okay, I have to share screen again, I think. Okay, so my next slide, conclusion. The metaphysical and non-metaphysical approach as complementary. So
We wait for Prof to come back.
Us deal with the two different aspects of the problem. That is, while it is true that you need the metaphysical approach for the purposes of Aqidah and Iman and so on, but you also need to think of the realities of scientific life and scientific practice in this modern world. And therefore, you need also the pragmatic approach. But the pragmatic approach by itself, without the metaphysical approach, is also not sufficient, because then you might leave out something important, like, for example, Aqidah and questions of faith. Okay. Here, I would like to pose this, what I would call a crucial question regarding these matters, which is what I have wrote down as the Muslim dilemma concerning science. And what is the Muslim dilemma? On the one hand, Muslims need modern science and technology in order to survive and compete in this modern world. But on the other hand, Muslim critiques of science, as given by Nas and Najib, for example, have shown that scientific knowledge can be a threat to religion, threat in terms of the philosophies. And what is a threat? The threat can be in the form of belief, direct threat like Darwin's theory versus creationism. But the most subtle threat, as pointed out by Nas and Najib, is its implications on our worldview. If we take science as giving us true knowledge about the reality of the physical world, then this would necessarily have implications on the rest of our belief system, including the religious. Since reality, according to science and the philosophies of science, alike to it, is physical in nature and can only be known through rational and empirical means, therefore, that which is not physical and cannot be accessed through the mind and the five senses cannot be accepted as real. This would imply that we cannot affirm metaphysical truth, such as the existence of God, the angels, and the afterlife, which is based on revelation. So, in that sense, science can be a threat in terms of our worldview and our approach towards reality and so on. And how can we deal with this dilemma? So there are several ways of dealing with it. Number one is the easy way out, by compartmentalization. This is the easiest approach. We keep science in one side of our mental box and religion on the other side, so that they don't interact, and that we don't ask awkward questions. Awkward questions which would challenge our faith or pose difficult questions for us to answer if we try and make the connection between the two. So some people, they just take the easy way out by just doing science on the one hand and behaving as a good Muslim on the other hand, without asking the deeper question of what it means to hold these two beliefs, these two different sets of beliefs. Because if you go deeper like what Nas and Najib did, then you might find that there is a conflict which needs to be resolved. Okay, number two, which is in itself, I think, a way of dealing with this dilemma, my approach to it. Yeah? And this is by making a distinction between science as knowledge of nature, which is at the first order level or the object level, and philosophy of science as knowledge about science itself, that is at the meta or second order level. So in this case, philosophy of science presents us with images of science other than science itself. So there's a distinction to be made between science and our philosophical reflections of science, which is at the second order level. So the philosophical reflections of science can be either secular or religious, depending on which perspective you want to take. Yeah, because philosophy is basically humanities, and humanities, there is no one monolithic single paradigm which you necessarily have to adopt. You can adopt any perspective you choose, as long as you make a good case out of it. Yeah, you make a strong case in whatever perspective that you want to adopt. Yeah. So I think as Muslims, you can, at the second order level, develop your own philosophy of science. Yeah, in Islamic perspective on science or Islamic philosophy of science, that enables you to look at science, but at the same time not sacrificing or compromising your Islamic beliefs. Yeah, and it is at this meta level that we can talk of an Islamic perspective of science or Islamic philosophy of science. Yeah? And where science is viewed within a wider intellectual framework based on a different set of assumptions about the nature of reality. So again, the approach adopted by Nas and Najib is to look at science as part of a wider framework. So science is not everything, in other words. Yeah? Science is just part of a wider reality, where that wider reality would also encompass the unseen, which cannot be known through the rational and the empirical, which is the way of knowing in science. Yeah? And here I mentioned, for example, two thinkers, Malay Muslim thinkers. One is already arwah, the late arwah Ustaz Usman, sorry, I didn't put the word Usman al-Muhammadi. Yeah. And second one is Syed Taufiq Alatas, who made distinction between science and scientism. Muslims can accept science, but not scientism. So it is at the level of philosophy that we can dispute matters concerning science. Yeah? We can still accept science at the first level, at the object level. But at the meta level, where some philosophers like logical theorists try to elevate science to a higher philosophical level, which has implications for our belief systems on concerning nature of reality and so on, that can be contested. And that's where we can assert our intellectual authority as Muslims and try to define science in the way that the Muslim would, in a way that the Muslims can accept. Yeah. Yeah. So, in other words, it is possible for us, yeah, to retain our Islamic beliefs, our Islamic perspectives on reality, on nature, on the world, and so on, yeah, and subsume science within that broader worldview. Yeah, if we look at things from a wider perspective, for example, the nature of reality and so on, because science has already restricted reality by making assumptions on what can be studied and what cannot be studied. Yeah, but if we challenge those assumptions and operate on a different set of assumptions, which I think is quite legitimate, and in fact, as I pointed out, even Western thinkers, yeah, have done this. They have not seen it as compelling that we should only adopt one dimension concerning reality and so on. And if we take this perspective, then we can still assert our intellectual autonomy as Muslims, yeah, and articulate our own position as to what we think science is in relation to the broader Islamic view of nature and reality. And this should not in any way prevent us from practicing science in a pragmatic and a practical way also, which is what is needed in the contemporary world today, for the advancements of the Muslims themselves, the advancement of the Muslim Ummah. In fact, the Saudis is very keen, yeah, on R&D and on scientific research and so on. Even in terms of robotics, they have adopted Sophia as a Saudi citizen. I'm not sure whether it's a good thing, but it indicates that even in conservative Saudi Arabia, they have not rejected science, modern science and technology, and not see it as being conflict with the faith. So I think on that note, I end tonight's lecture. Thank you very much. Back to Brother Sharan.
Thank you, Prof. There are, I think, 5 or 7 major points in tonight's lecture. As Prof mentioned that God do punish human with the natural phenomena like a strong wind, earthquake, and things. So this, that's it. Which can be proven by science. So there are relationship, as Prof point out, and of course the argument that when it comes to qada and qadar, that nothing can be argued about, like time of death. When the time is come, we die regardless of the causes. So thank you so much, Prof. We look forward for final lecture next week. As Prof has mentioned that we will have a 8-week session only for question and answers. So till then, we'll see you again next week, Prof. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.